Introduction: The Invisible Architecture of Human Life. Before we begin, I want you to think about something that has probably happened to you more than once. Have you ever made a decision that felt completely logical, only to realize months later that it changed the course of your life for reasons you never understood? Maybe it was accepting a job, trusting someone, ending a relationship, buying something you didn't really need, or believing an idea that later turned out to be completely wrong. You probably thought it was your decision. What if it wasn't? What if, long before you became aware of making that choice, invisible psychological forces had already pushed your mind toward a conclusion? What if the greatest influence on your life isn't your intelligence, or your personality, or even your willpower, but a collection of hidden laws quietly shaping every thought, every emotion, every judgment, and every decision you make? Most people spend their entire lives without ever seeing those laws. After today, you won't be one of them, because once you recognize them, you can never unsee them. And that changes everything. Let me tell you about a deal that should have worked. In the early 2000s, an experienced investment banker in London spent weeks negotiating the sale of part of a successful family business. Everything was perfect. The numbers were fair. The valuation was solid. The legal documents were flawless. Every expert involved agreed that both sides would benefit. Then, only hours before signing the agreement, the client suddenly walked away. Nothing about the business had changed. Nothing about the market had changed. Only one thing had changed. Weeks earlier, another investor had casually mentioned a much higher number. It wasn't supported by evidence. It wasn't realistic. It wasn't even part of the negotiation. But that single number quietly anchored itself inside the client's mind. From that moment on, every fair offer suddenly felt unfair. The deal never happened. The banker spent months searching for the mistake. He checked out the paperwork, the financial models, the legal details. He found nothing, because the real mistake wasn't in the contract. It was inside the human mind. The same invisible force that destroyed that negotiation quietly influences thousands of decisions you make every single year. Who you trust, who you fear, who you admire, what you buy, which opportunities you reject, why you stay in relationships long after they stop making you happy, why you repeat habits you promised yourself you would quit, why smart people can be manipulated, confident people can be deceived, and good people can unknowingly make terrible decisions. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Human beings love to believe they think logically. We imagine ourselves carefully collecting evidence before reaching conclusions. Reality is very different. Long before conscious thought enters the picture, hidden psychological mechanisms have already begun shaping what feels true, valuable, dangerous, attractive, or familiar. These mechanisms are not flaws. They are not signs of weakness. They are part of the operating system of the human mind. They affect everyone, the educated and the uneducated, the wealthy and the poor, leaders and followers, scientists and artists, politicians and ordinary families. No one is exempt. That is why this book exists, not to teach tricks, not to give you motivational slogans, and certainly not to promise that one magical morning routine will transform your life, because shortcuts disappear as soon as circumstances change. Laws do not. A trick helps you solve one problem. A law helps you understand every version of that problem for the rest of your life. Throughout this journey, you will discover 25 hidden laws governing human behavior. Some explain why people manipulate. Some reveal why we deceive ourselves. Others uncover why groups change individual thinking, why environments silently control choices, why time distorts judgment, and why meaning determines far more of our lives than we realize. Every law is grounded in decades of research, from psychology behavioral economics, neuroscience, sociology, and real-world observation. But this is not an academic lecture. This is a guide to seeing the invisible machinery operating beneath everyday life. As you listen, you'll begin noticing things you have overlooked for years. You'll recognize manipulation while it's happening. You'll understand why certain conversations change people forever. You'll notice invisible influences inside advertisements, negotiations, relationships, social media, workplaces, even inside your own thoughts. By the end of this audiobook, I don't expect you to memorize 25 laws. I expect something much more valuable. I expect that you'll never look at human behavior the same way again, because once you see the architecture beneath people's actions, you stop reacting to appearances. You begin understanding causes. And understanding causes is where real freedom begins. So, if you're ready to discover the hidden system quietly directing human behavior, let's begin where every one of those invisible laws begins, inside your own mind. Part 1. The Self. How you think, decide, and become who you are. Law 1. The Law of the Divided Mind. Here's a question for you, and I want you to answer it as fast as you can. A bat and a ball cost 1 cent together. The bat cost 1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? If the number 10 cents jumped into your head, you're in good company. Most people, including students at Harvard, MIT, and Princeton, give that answer first. It's also wrong. If the ball cost 10 cents, the bat would cost $1.10, making the total $1.20, not $1.10. The correct answer is 5 cents. Nothing about this problem is difficult. It requires no special knowledge, no advanced math, and yet the wrong answer arrives first, confidently, for almost everyone. Because of how your mind is built, psychologist Daniel Kahneman spent much of his career, alongside his collaborator Amos Tversky, mapping this exact phenomenon, work that eventually earned Kahneman the Nobel Prize in economics. Their central discovery was that the mind operates through two very different systems. The first is fast, automatic, intuitive, and effortless. It recognizes a friend's face in a crowd, finishes the phrase bread and reacts to a sudden loud noise before you've consciously registered what happened. The second is slow, deliberate, effortful, and rule-based. It's what you use to fill out a tax form, compare 2 mortgage offers, or solve the bat and ball problem correctly if you actually pause to check your work. The trouble is that the fast system doesn't wait to be asked. It offers an answer, an impression, a judgment almost instantly, and the slow system, tired, lazy, easily satisfied, usually just rubber stamps whatever the fast system hands it. Kahneman described this as a kind of cognitive division of labor gone wrong. The deliberate system believes it's in charge, but in practice, it acts more like a supervisor who reads a summary and signs off, rather than an investigator who checks every fact. This law explains far more of your daily life than you might expect. Think about the last time you formed an opinion about someone within the first few seconds of meeting them. Their handshake, their posture, the tone of their first sentence. That impression came from the fast system, and research on first impressions has repeatedly shown that people form judgments about traits like trustworthiness and competence within a fraction of a second of seeing a new face, judgments that then color everything they notice afterward. The slow system rarely goes back to check whether that snap judgment was fair. It usually just looks for evidence to confirm what the fast system already decided. Doctors are not immune to this either. Studies of diagnostic reasoning have found that experienced physicians often reach a working diagnosis within the first minute or two of a patient encounter based on pattern recognition, the fast system doing what it does best. In most cases, this is remarkably accurate because pattern recognition built from years of experience is powerful. But it is also the reason diagnostic errors cluster around cases that resemble a common condition. but are secretly something rarer. The fast system matches the pattern, and the slow system, unless specifically trained to double-check, doesn't intervene. The reason this matters for you is not that fast thinking is bad and slow thinking is good. Quite the opposite. Fast thinking is what allows you to function at all. If you had to consciously deliberate over every decision, from which foot to put forward when walking to whether that shape in your peripheral vision is a threat, you would be paralyzed within minutes. The fast system exists because it's efficient, and most of the time, it's right. The law is not distrust your instincts. The law is know which kind of decision you're making and match the right system to it. Some decisions are genuinely low stakes and pattern-based. What to order at a restaurant you've been to 50 times, whether to smile back at someone who smiles at you. Let the fast system handle those. Overthinking them wastes energy and often makes the choice worse, a phenomenon researchers have called choice overload, where too much deliberation over trivial decisions actually reduces satisfaction with the outcome. But other decisions are exactly the kind where the fast system quietly leads you astray. Negotiating a salary, evaluating a major financial commitment, judging whether someone's explanation for a broken promise is genuine, deciding whether to end a relationship. In these cases, the first answer that arrives, confident, immediate, emotionally loaded, deserves suspicion precisely because of how confident and immediate it is. The feeling of certainty is not evidence of accuracy. It is simply a signal that the fast system has finished its work, not that its work was correct. A practical way to apply this law is what I think of as the waiting period rule for significant decisions. When you notice a fast, strong reaction to something important, an urge to fire off an angry email, to accept a job offer on the spot, to end a friendship over a single comment, deliberately create space before acting. Not because the feeling is wrong, but because you don't yet know whether it's wrong. And the only way to find out is to let the slower system actually do its job, instead of simply approving what the faster one already decided. I think about that London banker often. His client's fast system had already decided, the moment he heard that rival number weeks earlier, what the business was really worth. Every fact the banker presented afterward was being filtered through a judgment that had already been made in an instant. No amount of slow, careful, rational argument was going to undo a decision the fast system had already locked into place, because that is not how the two systems work. The fast system doesn't wait for permission. It moves first, and unless you catch it in the act, it will always look, in hindsight, exactly like your own careful, considered judgment. Learning to notice the difference is the first hidden law, and arguably the foundation for every law that follows. Law 2, the law of the depleting will. Imagine two groups of people, hungry and irritable after skipping a meal, sitting in a room with a plate of fresh, warm chocolate chip cookies and a bowl of plain radishes. One group is told they may eat the cookies. The other is told they must eat only the radishes, resisting the cookies sitting right in front of them. Afterward, both groups are given a puzzle to solve, one that is, unknown to them, actually unsolvable. The question researchers wanted answered was simple. How long would each group persist before giving up? This was the design of a now famous study conducted by psychologist Roy Baumeister and his colleagues in the 1990s. The cookie eaters worked on the impossible puzzle for about 20 minutes on average. The radish eaters, who had just spent several minutes resisting temptation, gave up after only about 8 minutes. Nothing about the puzzle had changed. What had changed was the state of their willpower, and Baumeister's team concluded that self-control draws from a limited shared resource, one that gets depleted by use, the way a muscle tires after repeated exertion. They called this phenomenon ego depletion. The metaphor of willpower as a muscle has since been debated and refined by decades of further research, and it's worth being honest with you about that. Some later, larger studies have struggled to replicate the exact size of the original effect, and the field now understands willpower as something more complicated than a simple fuel tank that empties and refills. But the core observation has held up remarkably well across a wide range of contexts: acts of self-control, resisting a craving, suppressing an emotion, making a difficult decision, sustaining focus on a boring task. Draw on the same limited pool of mental resources, and that pool is finite over the course of a day. This is why judges, in a widely cited study of Israeli parole boards, were found to grant parole far more often in the hours right after a meal break than in the hours right before one. Not because the cases heard were different, but because the judge's capacity for the effortful, careful deliberation that fair judgment requires had been worn down by a long stretch of decisions. By the end of a session, tired and depleted, the easier default, denying parole, maintaining the status quo, became more likely, regardless of the actual merits of the case in front of them. This is why, if you've ever wondered why you can hold your temper through an entire stressful workday, only to snap at your partner or your children over something trivial, the moment you walk through the door in the evening, you are not a bad partner or a bad parent. You are a person who has spent an entire day's supply of self-regulation on your job, your commute, and every small frustration you swallowed along the way, and there is simply less left by the time you reach the people who deserve your patience the most. This is one of the cruelest ironies of willpower. It tends to run lowest exactly when we're home with the people we love most, because they are the ones who get whatever is left over. The practical implication of this law is not that you should try harder to have more willpower. It's that willpower should be treated as a scarce resource to be budgeted, not a character trait to be shamed for lacking. If you know that your resolve is strongest in the morning, that is when you should schedule the hardest, most important use of self-control in your day: the difficult conversation, the workout, the writing you've been avoiding, rather than saving it for the evening, when the tank is already close to empty. There is also a second, quieter strategy suggested by this research: reduce the number of small acts of self-control required of you throughout the day, so there's more left for the moments that actually matter. This is part of why highly successful people in demanding roles often report wearing a limited rotation of similar outfits, or eating the same meals repeatedly, or automating routine decisions wherever possible. It isn't eccentricity, it's resource management. Every trivial decision you eliminate from your day is willpower preserved for the decision that will actually shape your life. Environment matters here too, more than most people assume. If self-control is a limited resource, the smartest use of it is not fighting temptation face to face, but designing your surroundings so the temptation isn't there to fight in the first place. Keeping junk food out of the house, logging out of distracting apps, or simply not carrying your wallet on a shopping trip you didn't plan to make are not admissions of weak character. They are precisely what someone who understands this law would do, because willpower spent avoiding temptation is willpower unavailable for everything else that day. None of this means you are helpless against your own impulses. It means the fight is smarter when you stop treating willpower as an infinite well of moral fiber and start treating it as what the evidence actually shows it to be: a finite, fluctuating, and deeply human resource, one that behaves less like a fixed trait and more like a mood, rising after rest, falling after use, and shaping far more of your daily behavior than you've probably ever given it credit for. Law 3. The law of the rewritten memory. I want you to think of a vivid memory, something emotional, something you'd swear you remember with total clarity. Maybe it's where you were when you heard a piece of shocking news, or a moment from a wedding, an argument, a loss. Now I want to gently suggest something that might be uncomfortable. A meaningful part of that memory is probably wrong, and you would never know it because it feels exactly as real as the parts that are accurate. This isn't speculation. It's one of the most thoroughly demonstrated findings in cognitive psychology. Memory researcher Elizabeth Loftus spent decades studying what she called the misinformation effect, showing that memories are not recordings that get pulled up unchanged, but reconstructions that get rebuilt slightly differently every single time you access them. In one of her classic studies, participants watched a film of a car accident and were then asked how fast the cars were going when they smashed into each other versus when they simply hit each other. The word choice alone changed their estimates of speed, and more strikingly, a week later, participants who'd heard the word smashed were more likely to falsely remember seeing broken glass in the film, glass that was never there. This matters far beyond car crash experiments. In the American legal system, eyewitness misidentification has been a contributing factor in a substantial share of wrongful convictions, later overturned by DNA evidence, according to work compiled by the Innocence Project. Witnesses aren't lying. They are doing exactly what memory does, rebuilding an account each time they're asked, incorporating new information, a detective's leading question, a photograph shown at the wrong moment, a conversation with another witness, into what feels like an original, untouched recollection. Here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you in a useful way. This doesn't just happen to eyewitnesses in courtrooms. It happens to you about your own childhood, your own relationships, your own history. Every time you recall an old argument with a partner, you are not replaying a tape. You are reconstructing the scene using your current mood, your current opinion of that person, and everything you've learned or felt since. If you're currently frustrated with someone, your reconstructed memory of past conflicts with them will likely skew more negative than the reality was. If you've since forgiven them, the same memory may soften. The past isn't fixed in your mind. It is being rewritten quietly in the direction of your present. This is also why family members can have wildly different, equally sincere memories of the same childhood event, not because someone is being dishonest, but because each person reconstructed the memory through the lens of their own role in the story, their own emotional state at the time, and everything that's happened to them since. The version each person holds feels completely authentic, because reconstruction always feels like retrieval. There is no internal warning light that goes off to tell you, this detail has shifted since the last time you thought about it. There's a specific, well-documented pattern that makes this worse, what psychologists call flashbulb memories, the vivid recollections people have of exactly where they were during a major shocking event, a terrorist attack, an assassination, the start of a pandemic. People report these memories with extraordinary confidence, describing the room, the light, the exact words spoken. Yet, research tracking people's accounts of the same event over months and years has found that the details shift substantially over time, even as the person's confidence in their accuracy stays high or even increases. Confidence and accuracy, it turns out, are almost entirely unrelated when it comes to memory. You can be completely certain and completely wrong at the same time, and there's no way to tell from the inside. So, what do you do with a mind that rewrites its own history every time you open the file? You don't need to become paranoid about every memory you hold. Most of the broad strokes of your past are probably reasonably accurate, and this law isn't a reason to distrust everything you remember. But it is a reason to hold your memories, especially the emotionally charged ones, a little more loosely than you currently do, especially in conflict. The next time you find yourself in an argument built on dueling memories, you said this, no, you said that, It can help enormously to recognize that both of you may be telling the truth as you each reconstructed it, and that neither version is a lie, even if they contradict each other completely. This single reframe diffuses an enormous amount of relational conflict because it replaces "you're lying to me" with "we remember this differently," and that's what memory does. That shift alone, applied consistently, will save you more arguments than almost any other insight in this book. It also means that if you want an accurate record of something important, a negotiation, a medical conversation, a promise made by someone you'll need to hold accountable later, write it down at the time, immediately, rather than trusting your future recollection of it. Your memory is a brilliant, adaptive, meaning-making machine. It was never built to be a court stenographer, and expecting it to behave like one is where most of this trouble begins. Law 4, the law of the story you tell. There's a particular kind of psychological interview developed by researcher Dan McAdams and his colleagues over several decades, in which people are asked not just to describe their lives, but to narrate them, to identify the key laws, the turning points, the moments of change, and to explain how they got from who they were to who they are now. What McAdams found across thousands of these life story interviews is that the specific narrative structure someone uses to tell their own story predicts a great deal about their psychological well-being, often more than the actual facts of what happened to them. People whose life stories follow what McAdams called a redemptive pattern, where hardship is described as leading to growth, where suffering is framed as having ultimately served a purpose, tend to report significantly higher levels of life satisfaction, generativity, and mental health than people whose stories, containing similar or even less severe hardships, follow a contamination pattern in which good moments are described as being ruined or undone by what came after. Two people can have nearly identical biographical facts, a difficult divorce, a job loss, an illness, and walk away with entirely different levels of well-being, based largely on the story they've constructed around those facts. This is one of the more startling implications in all of narrative psychology. Your identity is not simply a record of what happened to you. It is an ongoing act of authorship, one you're engaged in constantly, usually without realizing it, every time you explain to yourself or to someone else why something happened, or what kind of person you are because of it. Inside are two people who both lost a business. One tells the story like this: "I failed, I wasn't cut out for it, and it confirmed what I always suspected about myself." The other tells a version like this: "It fell apart, and it was brutal, but it taught me things about risk and about myself that I couldn't have learned any other way, and it changed the direction of what I built next." These are not simply two moods layered over the same facts. Over time, McAdams's research suggests these different narrative framings actually shape future behavior. The redemptive storyteller is measurably more likely to take the next risk, to try again, to interpret setbacks as data rather than verdicts. The story doesn't just describe the person. It builds the person going forward. This connects to something psychologist Carol Dweck documented in a different but related body of research on what she called mindset. Dweck found that people who hold a fixed mindset, who believe abilities and traits are essentially set in stone, interpret failure as evidence of a fundamental, unchangeable limitation. "I failed because I'm not smart enough." People with a growth mindset, by contrast, interpret the exact same failure as information about effort and strategy. "I failed because I used the wrong approach, and I can adjust." Dweck's studies, including work with students facing academic setbacks, found that this single difference in self-narrative predicted persistence, resilience, and ultimately achievement, independent of actual measured ability. What both bodies of research point to is the same underlying law. The story you tell about your own life is not a neutral report. It is an active ingredient in what your life becomes next. This is not the same as saying facts don't matter, or that you can simply positive think your way out of real hardship. That would trivialize genuine suffering and genuine constraint. It's saying something more precise. The same set of facts can be woven into a story that traps you or a story that equips you, and which one you choose, consciously or not, has real measurable consequences. Here is a practical exercise worth trying, one drawn directly from narrative therapy techniques used by clinicians. Take a difficult law of your life, something painful, something you've told yourself a version of many times, and try writing it again deliberately as a redemptive story, not by lying about what happened, but by searching honestly for what it built in you, what it taught you, what door it closed that needed closing, or what door it opened that you wouldn't otherwise have found. This isn't about denial. It's about noticing that you have more authorial control over the meaning of your past than you've been exercising. The story you're currently telling about yourself, the one about why you are the way you are, why certain doors closed, why certain relationships failed, is not simply a mirror reflecting your history back at you. It is closer to an architect's plan, quietly determining what gets built on that foundation from here. Change the plan without lying about the foundation, and you change what becomes possible to build. Law 5, the law of the moving target. Here is one of the strangest, best documented paradoxes in the entire field of psychology. The more directly you pursue happiness as a goal, the more likely you are to end up feeling worse. Researchers Iris Moss and June Gruber ran a series of studies in which they measured how much value people placed on happiness itself, not on the things that might produce it, but on the abstract goal of being happy, and then tracked those people's actual well-being over time. Counterintuitively, the people who valued happiness the most, who monitored their own emotional state most closely and treated feeling good as an explicit target to hit, reported lower life satisfaction and were more prone to depressive symptoms than people who didn't fixate on happiness as a goal at all. In one striking part of the research, they found that this effect grew stronger during low-stress periods, suggesting it wasn't simply that unhappy people chase happiness harder. The chasing itself seemed to undermine the outcome. Why would wanting to be happy make you less happy? Part of the answer lies in what monitoring does to an emotional state. When you treat happiness as a target and constantly check whether you've hit it, am I enjoying this enough? Is this the good life I was supposed to be building? You introduce a kind of self-conscious evaluation into moments that would otherwise unfold naturally. Joy, like sleep, tends to recede the harder you grasp directly for it. You can't force yourself to fall asleep by trying hard enough to sleep. The trying itself is the obstacle. Happiness behaves in a strikingly similar way. There's a related and equally important body of research here from psychologist Sonia Lyubomirsky and colleagues on what's sometimes called hedonic adaptation, the finding that humans adjust remarkably quickly to both positive and negative life changes, returning to something close to their baseline level of well-being even after major events. Lottery winners, famously studied in early research on this topic, report happiness levels that, after the initial spike fades, converge back toward where they started. People who experience serious but non-fatal accidents after an initial period of distress often also return to something close to their prior baseline over time. This doesn't mean events don't matter. They clearly do, especially in the near term, and this research has real limits and caveats that later studies have refined. But it does mean that happiness is far less a fixed destination you arrive at and stay in, and far more a moving target that resets no matter what you achieve. If chasing happiness directly doesn't work, and if achieving things doesn't produce lasting gains in it either, What does the research actually suggest? Largely, it points toward happiness as a byproduct, something that tends to arise as a side effect of engagement, connection, and meaning, rather than something you can walk toward as a destination in itself. People who report the highest and most stable levels of well-being across long-term studies tend not to be people optimizing for feeling good moment to moment. They tend to be people absorbed in relationships, in work that matters to them, in communities they're contributing to, people who, if you ask them in the middle of a hard, demanding day, might not describe themselves as happy in the moment at all, but who report deep satisfaction when they zoom out and look at their life as a whole. This is why the pursuit of pleasure and the pursuit of a good life are not the same project, even though our culture often treats them as interchangeable. A life organized entirely around maximizing immediate pleasant feeling tends, paradoxically, to produce less overall satisfaction than a life organized around purpose, connection, and contribution, even though the second path involves plenty of moments that don't feel pleasant at all. None of this means you should feel guilty for wanting to feel good, or treat every pleasant feeling with suspicion. It means redirecting your attention away from the question, am I happy right now? And toward better questions. Am I engaged with something that matters to me? Am I connected to the people around me? Am I building something I'll be glad to look back on? Happiness, chased directly, slips away like a shadow that moves whenever you step toward it. Pursued indirectly, as the natural residue of a well-lived, well-connected, purposeful life, it has a much better chance of actually catching up to you. Part 2. The Others. How relationships and social forces shape your reality. Law 6. The Law of Reciprocity. In the 1970s, sociologist Philip Koons ran a small, almost mischievous experiment. He mailed Christmas cards, complete with a personal photo, to around 600 total strangers whose names he'd pulled essentially at random from a phone book. He had no relationship with any of them. What happened next surprised even him. Hundreds of strangers sent cards back. Many included personal notes, updates about their families, invitations to visit, as if a genuine relationship existed, built entirely on a single unearned gesture. This small study captures something Robert Cialdini would later place at the very center of his influential research on persuasion. Reciprocity is one of the most powerful, near-universal rules governing human social behavior. When someone gives us something, a gift, a favor, a concession, even an unsolicited one, we feel a strong, often unconscious pull to give something back, and that pull operates regardless of whether we ever asked for what we received in the first place. Cialdini's research, and decades of related work in social psychology, suggests this rule is so deeply wired that it can override our own preferences and even our own sense of whether we like the person we're reciprocating toward. In restaurant experiments, servers who gave diners a small piece of candy alongside the check saw tips increase noticeably. When they gave 2 pieces of candy while making eye contact and mentioning it was just for you, tips increased even more, not because the candy was worth anything, but because the gesture triggered an obligation to reciprocate with a larger tip than the diner might otherwise have left. The uncomfortable implication is that reciprocity is routinely used as a tool, deliberately by people who understand this law far better than most of us do. Free samples in a grocery store exist to trigger a mild sense of obligation. A negotiator who makes an exaggerated first demand, only to concede to something closer to what they actually wanted, is exploiting a close cousin of this law, sometimes called the door-in-the-face technique. The concession itself feels like a gift, and we feel pressure to reciprocate with our own concession, even when the final outcome favors the person who orchestrated the whole exchange. But reciprocity isn't only a manipulation tactic, It's also one of the fundamental forces holding healthy relationships and communities together. Anthropologists have long observed that gift-giving and favor exchange form the backbone of social bonds in cultures across the world, precisely because they create ongoing threads of mutual obligation that keep people connected to each other over time. A society or a friendship or a marriage without any reciprocity at all, where one person gives constantly and the other never returns anything, tends to become unstable and resentful, while a healthy reciprocal exchange, even an imperfect and uneven one over any single week, tends to sustain long-term trust. This means the law cuts two ways, and both directions are worth understanding. The first is defensive. When you feel a sudden, disproportionate urge to say yes to someone, to return a favor you never asked for, to match a concession in a negotiation, pause and ask whether you are responding to the actual merits of the situation or simply discharging an obligation that was deliberately created. A free gift from a salesperson is not actually free if it's expected to purchase your compliance later. Recognizing the mechanism doesn't mean becoming cold or ungrateful. It means separating gratitude for a gesture from an unexamined compulsion to repay it on someone else's terms. The second direction is constructive and arguably more valuable. Reciprocity is one of the most reliable, evidence-backed ways to build genuine goodwill and connection with other people, when used sincerely rather than manipulatively. Small, unprompted acts of generosity, remembering a detail about someone's life, offering help before being asked, giving credit generously in a group setting, tend to generate warmth and connection that compounds over time, precisely because they activate the same deep social wiring that Cialdini and Kuhns documented. The difference between manipulation and genuine relationship building often comes down to intent and proportion. Are you giving in order to obligate someone, or simply because you want to strengthen a connection that matters to you? Understanding this law well means you stop being blindly steered by unearned obligations you never consented to, while also becoming more deliberate and effective in the relationships you actually want to nurture. The strangers who received Kuhns's Christmas cards weren't foolish for writing back. They were behaving exactly as humans reliably behave. And once you see that mechanism clearly, you can decide consciously when to let it move you and when to simply notice it moving and choose your own response instead. Law 7, the law of social proof. In 1968, psychologists Bibb Latané and John Darley staged an unsettling experiment. A room began filling with smoke visible under the door, while a participant sat inside, completing what they believed was an unrelated survey. When the participant was alone in the room, the vast majority of people got up and reported the smoke within a couple of minutes. But when the same participant sat in a room with two other people who had been quietly instructed by the researchers to ignore the smoke and keep working, something remarkable happened. Most participants also stayed put, continuing their survey as smoke visibly accumulated, even as their eyes watered, because the calm, unconcerned behavior of the people around them signaled that this must not actually be an emergency. This experiment gave researchers one of the clearest demonstrations of what's now called social proof, or informational social influence. In situations of uncertainty, we look to the behavior of others to determine what's true, what's safe, and what's appropriate, often trusting the crowd's apparent calm over the direct evidence of our own senses. It's closely related to what's sometimes called the bystander effect, in which the presence of other people who aren't acting actually makes each individual less likely to act themselves, because everyone assumes that if the situation were truly serious, someone else would already be responding. Social proof is not a flaw limited to emergencies. It is a general-purpose shortcut your mind uses constantly, and it makes a lot of sense as a survival strategy. In most situations throughout human history, if everyone around you was calmly doing something or calmly not doing something, that behavior probably reflected accumulated, useful information about the environment that you didn't personally have time to gather yourself. The trouble is that this shortcut doesn't distinguish between a crowd that actually knows something and a crowd that is simply as confused as you are, each person individually looking to everyone else for a cue that never actually originates anywhere. This is why online reviews carry such outsized influence over purchasing decisions. Why a restaurant with a line out the door attracts more people to join that line rather than fewer, and why financial bubbles form and collapse the way they do, not because everyone involved has done independent research, but because each person observes everyone else buying, concludes that the others must know something, and joins in, creating a cascade that has nothing to do with the actual underlying value of what's being bought. Economists studying market bubbles have repeatedly found this same informational cascade pattern. Individually rational people, each reasonably trusting the apparent knowledge of the crowd, collectively produce a wildly irrational outcome. Social proof also plays a significant, well-documented role in public health behavior. Studies on household energy use conducted by behavioral scientists working with utility companies found that simply telling people how their energy consumption compared to their neighbor's average usage with no other change at all reliably reduced consumption among above-average users. No lecture on climate change was as effective as the simple information that people like you are already doing this. The same underlying mechanism has been used successfully to increase hotel towel reuse, encourage tax compliance, and boost voter turnout. In each case, telling people what others similar to them are actually doing shifted behavior more reliably than appeals to logic, self-interest, or morality on their own. Once you know this law, you can use it in two directions. Defensively, you can catch yourself before assuming that a crowded restaurant, a trending opinion, or a room full of calm, unreactive coworkers is automatically giving you accurate information. Sometimes a crowd is simply a room full of people, each individually looking to everyone else, with no one actually possessing the knowledge the group's confidence implies. It is worth asking, in moments of collective calm around a genuine problem, is everyone actually calm because they know something I don't? Or is everyone simply waiting for someone else to react first? Constructively, you can use this law to nudge your own behavior in directions you actually want. If you're trying to build a new habit, surrounding yourself with people who already have that habit is far more effective than relying on willpower alone, precisely because your mind will unconsciously use their normal behavior as a signal for what's normal and achievable for you too. Social proof isn't something that only happens to you. It's a lever you can deliberately place yourself near, pointed in a direction that serves the life you're actually trying to build. Law 8. The law of the closest stranger. There's a peculiar finding, replicated across many long-term marriage studies, that should give every couple pause. Spouses, even after decades together, are often strikingly bad at predicting how their partner actually feels, thinks, or would respond in a given situation. Frequently no more accurate than a stranger's reasonable guess, and sometimes overconfident in ways that make their errors worse. Researcher William Icks, who has spent much of his career studying what he calls empathic accuracy, has run numerous studies in which romantic partners are shown recordings of their own conversations and asked to guess what their partner was actually thinking or feeling at specific moments. The results are humbling. Accuracy is often only modestly better than chance, and this is the part that stings. The couples who report feeling closest and most connected are not necessarily the ones who guess most accurately. In fact, Some research on long-married couples suggests that empathic accuracy can actually decline over the length of a relationship, even as reported closeness stays the same or increases. This seems to contradict everything we assume about intimacy. Shouldn't knowing someone for 20 years make you better at reading them, not worse? The likely explanation researchers point to is what's sometimes called the closeness communication bias. The more familiar we become with someone, the more we rely on assumptions built from history rather than paying close attention to what they're actually communicating right now in this specific moment. Early in a relationship, we watch a new partner closely because we don't yet have a model of them to lean on. Years in, we stop watching as closely because we believe, often wrongly, that we already know how they'll respond, what they mean, and what they need. This law explains a huge amount of everyday relational friction that otherwise seems mysterious. A partner who says, "You never listen to me," is often not describing a total absence of attention, but a real and measurable decline in the kind of close, assumption-free listening that existed early on, replaced by a faster, more automatic form of listening that fills in gaps using an outdated model of who that person used to be. The stranger you met on a first date in a strange way sometimes got more careful attention than the spouse you've shared a home with for 15 years, not because you love the stranger more, but because familiarity itself lowers the amount of active effort your mind believes is necessary. There's a related concept worth understanding here, what psychologists call the fundamental attribution error, our persistent tendency to explain other people's behavior by their character. She's inconsiderate, while explaining our own identical behavior by our circumstances. I was exhausted and overwhelmed. This asymmetry compounds the closeness communication bias in long relationships. Over time, partners accumulate a mental catalog of each other's flaws attributed to fixed character, while continuing to grant themselves situational excuses for the exact same behaviors, and that asymmetry, left unexamined, quietly corrodes goodwill year after year. None of this means intimacy is a lie, or that long relationships are doomed to misunderstanding. It means real intimacy requires ongoing, deliberate maintenance of the kind of attention that new relationships get for free, simply because uncertainty forces it. Couples counselors who work from this research often recommend a simple, almost embarrassingly basic practice: asking rather than assuming, especially in moments of conflict or emotional intensity. What are you actually feeling right now? Ask genuinely, without assuming you already know the answer. Routinely surfaces information that decades of accumulated assumption had quietly overwritten. The deeper implication of this law is worth sitting with. The people closest to you are not necessarily the people you understand best. Understanding is not a function of time elapsed together. It's a function of attention paid, and attention is precisely the thing that closeness tempts us to stop paying, right when we most need it. Treating the people you love with a fraction of the careful, assumption-free curiosity you'd extend to an interesting stranger is not a betrayal of intimacy. Done consistently, it may be the single most reliable way to actually deepen it. Law 9, the law of status and belonging. Psychologist Susan Fiske, who has spent decades studying how people perceive and judge one another, along with her collaborators, identified something that shows up with remarkable consistency across virtually every culture studied. When people evaluate others, individuals, groups, even brands and institutions, their judgments cluster around two core dimensions, which Fiske's research labeled warmth and competence. Warmth answers the question, does this person mean me well? Are they part of my group? Can I trust their intentions? Competence answers a different question. Can this person actually do what they claim? Do they have the capability to back up their intentions? What makes this finding so important for understanding your own behavior is that these two dimensions map onto two deep, sometimes competing human drives: the drive to belong and the drive for status. Belonging is fundamentally about warmth, being accepted, being liked, being safely inside a group rather than excluded from it. Status is fundamentally about competence and respect, being seen as capable, valuable, worth deferring to. Both drives are ancient, both are largely unconscious, and much of what looks like confusing or contradictory social behavior becomes far more legible once you recognize these two forces frequently pulling in opposite directions. Consider why people so often soften an accomplishment when sharing it with friends. "Oh, I just got a little lucky," even when they're privately proud of real hard-earned success. This is the belonging drive quietly overriding the status drive. An unfiltered display of competence risks seeming boastful, which threatens acceptance within the group, so the achievement gets deliberately downplayed to protect warmth at the cost of status. Conversely, consider why people in competitive professional environments so often overstate their confidence and downplay their doubts, even at real cost to genuine connection with colleagues. Here, the status drive is winning out over the belonging drive, because in that particular context, appearing competent matters more than appearing warm. Neither drive is more noble or more shallow than the other. Both are deeply functional, forged by a long evolutionary history in which being excluded from your group could be fatal, and being seen as incompetent could cost you resources, mates, or survival. The trouble arises not from having these drives, but from misjudging which one a given situation actually calls for, or from environments, many modern workplaces among them, that force people into constant, exhausting tension between the two, rewarding confident self-promotion in one moment and punishing it as arrogance in the next. Fiska's research also found something with real practical value. People who are perceived as high in both warmth and competence, seen simultaneously as capable and as genuinely caring, receive the most positive, most trusting responses from others by a wide margin over people rated high on only one dimension. This matters because many people, in professional settings especially, instinctively believe they must choose: appear warm and approachable, or appear competent and authoritative, as if the two traits compete for the same limited space in another person's impression of them. The research suggests this trade-off is often a false one. Demonstrating genuine competence while also displaying authentic warmth, asking real questions, showing real interest, admitting real uncertainty where it exists, tends to outperform either trait pursued alone. Understanding this law gives you a genuinely useful diagnostic for your own behavior and relationships. When you notice yourself acting in a way that seems to work against your own interests, staying quiet about a real accomplishment, or conversely, pushing away people who could become close friends by constantly performing competence at them, it's worth asking which drive is currently running the show and whether it's actually the right one for this particular moment. Belonging and status are not enemies of each other, and you don't have to sacrifice one to have the other. But you do have to notice which one is quietly steering a given interaction, because as long as it operates outside your awareness, it will keep making that choice for you, whether or not it's the choice you'd actually make on purpose. Law 10. The Law of the Group Mind. In 1961, psychologist Stanley Milgram began a series of experiments that remain among the most discussed in the history of psychology. Participants were told they were assisting in a study of learning and punishment and were instructed by an authority figure in a lab coat to administer what they believed were increasingly severe electric shocks to another person whenever that person answered a question incorrectly. The learner was, unknown to the participant, an actor who received no actual shocks, but who performed increasingly distressed protests as the supposed voltage rose. Milgram's central, unsettling finding was that a substantial majority of ordinary participants, people with no particular cruelty or malice, continued administering what they believed were dangerous, even potentially lethal shocks, simply because a calm authority figure in the room told them to continue. Milgram's work is often summarized as being about obedience to authority, and it is that. But a closely related and equally important body of research, including Solomon Asch's earlier conformity experiments, showed something slightly different and in some ways more unsettling. People will override the clear evidence of their own eyes, not because an authority commanded them to, but simply because everyone else in the room appeared to see something different. In Asch's studies, participants were shown a line and asked to match it to one of 3 comparison lines, an exceptionally easy task with an obvious correct answer. But when several actors in the room, planted by the researchers, unanimously and confidently gave the wrong answer before the real participants' turn, roughly 3/4 of participants conformed to the group's incorrect answer at least once, even though the correct answer was visually obvious. What both lines of research point to is a broader law about how groups affect individual judgment. Being embedded in a group, whether led by a clear authority or simply surrounded by a confident consensus, measurably reduces your capacity to trust and act on your own independent perception, even in situations where that perception is entirely correct. This isn't a story about weak-willed people. Asch's participants interviewed afterward mostly knew the group's answer was wrong. Many conformed anyway, describing an overwhelming, almost physical discomfort at being the lone dissenting voice. This law scales up into something psychologist Irving Janis called groupthink, the tendency of cohesive groups, especially ones under pressure to reach a decision quickly, to suppress dissenting views, avoid critically examining alternatives, and converge on a shared judgment that no individual member, considered alone, might actually endorse. Janis developed this concept partly by studying historical policy disasters, arguing that many disastrous group decisions weren't caused by any individual's stupidity or malice, but by structural features of group dynamics, a strong pressure toward unanimity, a reluctance to be the one voice raising uncomfortable objections, and a false sense of collective invulnerability that emerges precisely because everyone in the room seems to agree. Understanding this law matters enormously for anyone who works, lives, or makes decisions inside groups, which is to say, for everyone. It suggests that the mere presence of apparent consensus should never, by itself, be treated as strong evidence that the consensus is correct, because that consensus may simply reflect the same conformity pressure Asch documented, with each person suppressing private doubts because no one else appears to share them, when in fact many people privately do. There are concrete, well-tested countermeasures worth knowing. Groups that deliberately assign someone the role of devil's advocate, explicitly tasked with arguing against the emerging consensus, make measurably better decisions than groups that don't. According to research on group decision-making, largely because it gives dissent an acceptable, structured outlet, rather than requiring one brave individual to break ranks unprompted. Similarly, decision processes, where each person privately records their independent judgment before any group discussion begins, tend to surface far more honest disagreement than open discussion alone, which tends to be shaped early by whoever speaks first and most confidently. The deepest lesson of this law is not that groups are dangerous, or that you should distrust every collective judgment you encounter. Groups, used well, are one of humanity's greatest tools for solving problems no individual could solve alone. But a group is not simply the sum of its members' honest opinions. It is a dynamic system with its own pressures, capable of suppressing exactly the information it most needs to make a good decision. Knowing that changes how you participate, and it means that the discomfort of being the lone dissenting voice in a room is not a sign that you're wrong. Sometimes it's the clearest sign that you're the only one still looking at the actual lines. Part 3. The World. How Context, Environment, and Systems Hijack Behavior. Law 11. The Law of the Anchor. Ask one group of people whether Gandhi died before or after age 140, then ask them to guess his actual age at death. Ask a second group the same question, but reference age 9 instead of 140. Both groups know perfectly well that Gandhi didn't die at 140 and didn't die at 9 either. The comparison ages are absurd on their face. And yet, in exactly this experiment, conducted by researchers building on Kahneman and Tversky's foundational work, the group anchored to 140 guessed a substantially higher age at death than the group anchored to 9. An obviously irrelevant, obviously absurd number still dragged their final estimate in its direction. This is the law of anchoring, one of the most robust and thoroughly replicated findings in all of behavioral science. The first number or idea you encounter, even one you consciously recognize as arbitrary or irrelevant, exerts a measurable gravitational pull on every judgment that follows. Your mind doesn't evaluate a new estimate from scratch. It adjusts outward from whatever reference point got planted first, and that adjustment is almost always insufficient. You move away from the anchor, but not nearly as far as you would have if the anchor had never been mentioned at all. Kahneman and Tversky's original demonstration of this effect used a rigged wheel of fortune spun in front of participants to land on either a low number or a high number before asking participants to estimate the percentage of African countries in the United Nations, a question with no logical connection whatsoever to a spinning wheel. Participants who saw the wheel land on a high number gave substantially higher percentage estimates than participants who saw it land on a low number. The wheel was random. Everyone knew it was random. It anchored their judgment anyway. This law is exploited, often quite deliberately, in negotiations of every kind. Real estate agents understand that a home listed at a somewhat inflated asking price shifts buyers' sense of what the property is really worth upward. Even among buyers who intend to negotiate hard and who consciously know the listing price is a starting point rather than a fair valuation. Retailers understand that showing a crossed-out original price next to a sale price anchors your sense of value to the higher number, making the discounted price feel far more generous than it might in isolation. Skilled negotiators, in salary discussions and business deals alike, understand that whoever names the first number in a negotiation gains a lasting, disproportionate influence over where the final number lands, which is why negotiation experts frequently advise making the first offer yourself whenever you have reasonable information to do so, rather than waiting to respond to someone else's anchor. What makes this law particularly powerful and particularly dangerous to be unaware of is that it operates even when you consciously know you're being anchored. Researchers have run studies in which participants were explicitly warned in advance that an upcoming number was random and designed purely to test anchoring effects, and the anchoring still worked, just slightly reduced in magnitude. Awareness alone doesn't neutralize this law the way it can neutralize some other biases. This isn't a flaw you can simply think your way out of by knowing about it. It requires active, structural countermeasures. Fortunately, those countermeasures exist and are well tested. The single most effective one is doing your own independent research and forming your own estimate before encountering anyone else's anchor, knowing the fair market range for a used car before you see the dealer's sticker price, knowing typical salary bands for your role before a recruiter names a number, knowing a property's comparable sales before you see its listing price. A second useful technique, when you can't avoid encountering an anchor first, is to deliberately and explicitly generate a counter-anchor in your own mind, consciously imagining an extreme opposite figure before responding, which research suggests helps offset some of the pull of the original number. It's worth appreciating, too, that anchoring isn't purely a tool of manipulation to be defended against. It's also a tool you can use constructively and ethically in your own life. If you're pricing your own work, making a first offer in a negotiation you have every right to shape, or setting expectations at the start of a project, deliberately setting a well-reasoned, favorable-to-you anchor, stated with genuine confidence, will shift the entire subsequent conversation in your direction, not through deception, but simply by understanding how the mind processes the very first number it hears. The deeper truth of this law is unsettling precisely because it reveals how little of your judgment is actually built from scratch. Most of your estimates about value, fairness, and likelihood are not independent calculations. They are adjustments from a starting point someone else, a wheel, a listing price, a rival's careless remark in a meeting weeks earlier, planted in your mind, often without your noticing, and often without their even meaning to. Law 12, the law of the frame. In a landmark study, Kahneman and Tversky presented participants with a hypothetical public health scenario, a disease outbreak expected to kill 600 people, with two possible treatment programs. Program A would save 200 people with certainty. Program B carried a 1/3 probability of saving all 600 people and a 2/3 probability of saving no one. Presented this way, a strong majority of participants chose Program A, the certain, positively framed option. A second group of participants was given the exact same underlying facts, the same outcomes, the same probabilities, but described differently. Program A in this version was described as resulting in 400 deaths with certainty. Program B carried a 1/3 probability that no one would die and a 2/3 probability that all 600 would die. These are mathematically identical outcomes to the first framing. 200 saved is the same as 400 lost out of 600. But faced with the loss-framed version, the majority of participants reversed their preference, choosing the risky option instead. Nothing about the actual choice changed. Only the words did: saved versus died, gains versus losses. And that single shift in framing was enough to flip the majority preference of an entire group of people. This became one of the founding demonstrations of what Kahneman and Tversky called prospect theory, for which Kahneman later received the Nobel Prize. And one of its central findings is that human beings are not simply loss-averse in the abstract. We respond differently to identical outcomes, depending on whether they are described as gains or as losses, feeling losses roughly twice as intensely in psychological terms as equivalent gains. This law shapes an enormous amount of the world around you, often invisibly. Consider medical decision-making. Studies have found that patients are significantly more likely to consent to a surgical procedure when told it has a 90% survival rate than when told, with mathematically identical information, that it has a 10% mortality rate. Doctors making the same recommendation, describing the same actual risk, get different responses depending entirely on which side of the same coin they choose to describe. Marketers and policymakers alike understand and use this law constantly. Ground beef labeled 75% lean is rated as more appealing by consumers in blind taste tests than identical beef labeled 25% fat, despite being the literal same product. Retirement savings programs that automatically enroll employees, framing non-participation as an active opt-out choice rather than a passive default, produce dramatically higher participation rates than programs framed the opposite way, even when the actual financial terms offered are identical, a finding with such consistent, large effects that it has reshaped retirement policy design in numerous countries. What makes this law especially important to understand is that it reveals something uncomfortable about the nature of your own preferences. They are not fixed, stable things you carry around and simply report when asked. They are, to a significant degree, constructed in the moment, shaped by whatever frame happens to be presented to you. This doesn't mean you have no genuine values or preferences at all, but it does mean that the specific choice you make in any given moment is far more sensitive to presentation than most people, most of the time, are willing to admit. The practical defense against being unknowingly steered by framing is a habit worth building deliberately. Whenever you're presented with a choice framed heavily in terms of gain or loss, certainty or risk, deliberately translate it into the opposite frame before deciding. If you're told a treatment has a 90% survival rate, consciously restate it to yourself as a 10% mortality rate and notice whether your gut reaction changes. If it does, and for most people, it will, that's valuable information. It tells you the frame, not the facts, was doing at least part of the persuading, and it gives you a chance to make the decision based on the underlying reality rather than the packaging it arrived in. There's a constructive side to this law as well, and it's worth naming honestly. Understanding framing gives you real power to communicate more effectively and more honestly, not just to manipulate. If you genuinely want to help someone make a decision that's actually good for them, encouraging a friend toward a beneficial medical procedure, motivating a team toward a difficult but necessary change, presenting the same true information in the frame most likely to produce clear thinking, rather than the frame most likely to trigger fear or complacency, is not manipulation. It's simply understanding that facts don't arrive naked in the human mind. They always arrive wearing a frame, and someone gets to choose which one, ideally, with intention, you. Law 13, the law of the environment. In the late 2000s, researchers examining vending machine sales data in schools and workplaces made a discovery that seems almost too simple to be meaningful. When healthier snacks were placed at eye level and less healthy snacks were moved to lower or higher shelves requiring more effort to reach, healthier snack sales rose substantially, often by 20 to 30% or more, without any change in price, any change in advertising, or any appeal to willpower whatsoever. People didn't become more disciplined. Their environment simply made the easier choice slightly easier and the harder choice slightly harder, and behavior shifted accordingly. This is one of many findings behind what behavioral economists Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein called choice architecture. The idea that every environment in which a decision is made is already structured in some way, whether deliberately or by accident, and that structure shapes outcomes at least as powerfully as individual willpower or preference does. There is no such thing as a neutral environment. A cafeteria that puts salad first in the line and dessert last is architected differently than one that puts them in reverse order, and study after study has found that the order of a cafeteria line meaningfully changes what people actually eat, regardless of what they might claim their intentions were walking in. This law directly challenges one of the most persistent myths in popular self-help culture, the idea that success or failure in areas like diet, spending, or productivity is primarily a matter of personal discipline. The research strongly suggests something less flattering to our sense of individual control and ultimately more useful. Your environment is doing an enormous amount of the work, in both directions all the time, and the people who seem to have superhuman willpower are very often people who have simply, deliberately, or accidentally built environments that require less willpower to begin with Consider a well-documented finding from research on food environments. People served food on larger plates consistently eat more than people served identical portions on smaller plates, even though the smaller plate group reports feeling equally full and satisfied afterward. The plate size didn't change hunger. It changed the visual and physical environment surrounding the meal, and behavior followed the environment rather than any internally generated sense of appropriate portion size. This same law operates powerfully in the world of personal finance. Research on commitment devices, structural features that make a desired behavior easier and an undesired one harder, has found that automatic payroll deductions into retirement accounts produce dramatically higher savings rates than programs that simply encourage people to transfer money manually each month, even when the amount and the underlying financial logic are completely identical. The friction of having to actively decide every single month to move money into savings is enough for a large share of people to prevent the saving from happening at all. Remove that friction. Make saving the automatic default rather than an active choice, and the same people who couldn't seem to save begin saving substantially without any change in their willpower or financial knowledge whatsoever. The practical power of this law lies in a shift of focus. Instead of asking, "How do I become more disciplined?" a more productive question is almost always, "How do I redesign my environment so that the behavior I want requires less discipline and the behavior I don't want requires more?" If you want to read more and scroll your phone less before bed, the redesign isn't a heroic act of willpower each night. It's charging your phone in another room and leaving a book on your nightstand instead. If you want to eat better, the redesign isn't resisting the cookies in your pantry through sheer force of will each evening. It's simply not having the cookies in the pantry so that the choice architecture of your own kitchen is quietly working for you instead of against you. This doesn't mean personal responsibility is meaningless or that you bear no agency over your choices. Quite the opposite. The most genuinely responsible, agentic thing you can do once you understand this law is to take deliberate control of your environment before the moment of temptation arrives, rather than relying on willpower to win a fight in the moment, a fight that the research in this law and the last one both suggest you are likely eventually to lose. The environment is not the enemy of willpower. Used deliberately, it is willpower's most powerful and most underused ally. Law 14, the law of scarcity. In a study that has become a classic in the field of consumer psychology, researchers Stephen Warkle, Jerry Lee, and Akanbi Adewole gave participants identical cookies from identical jars, with one crucial difference. Some jars contained 10 cookies, others contained only 2. Participants who received cookies from the nearly empty jar consistently rated the cookies as more desirable, higher in quality, and more valuable than participants who received the identical cookie from the fuller jar, despite there being no actual difference in the cookies themselves whatsoever. The only thing that changed was the apparent scarcity of supply, and that alone was enough to alter perceived value. This finding sits at the heart of what Robert Cialdini identified as the scarcity principle, one of the most consistently exploited forces in marketing, negotiation, and persuasion. When something appears limited in supply, in time, in availability, our sense of its value rises, often independent of any change in its actual usefulness or quality. This isn't simply about greed or materialism. It appears to be rooted in a deep evolutionary logic. Throughout most of human history, resources that were scarce genuinely often were more valuable, because scarcity frequently signaled real competition and real risk of loss, and a mental shortcut that treats limited as valuable would have served our ancestors reasonably well most of the time. The trouble, as with several laws in this book, is that this ancient shortcut is easily and profitably manufactured in the modern world by people who understand it far better than the average consumer does. Only 3 left in stock. Sale ends tonight at midnight. Limited edition, while supplies last. Each of these familiar phrases is a direct, deliberate activation of the scarcity principle, and research on consumer behavior confirms they work. Studies on countdown timers and low stock indicators in online retail environments have found they measurably increase purchase rates and reduce the time shoppers spend deliberating, precisely because scarcity triggers urgency, and urgency short-circuits the slower, more careful evaluation process described back in Law 1. Cialdini's research identified a particularly potent variant of this principle. Scarcity created by restriction after initial abundance is often more powerful than scarcity that was present from the start. In one striking study, participants who were told about a product's benefits and then told it was about to become unavailable rated it more favorably than participants who were simply told from the beginning that it was scarce. The experience of losing access to something, even something you hadn't previously placed much value on, activates a stronger reaction than never having had easy access in the first place, which is part of why limited-time reversals of previously available discounts or the removal of a familiar product from shelves often generate outsized public reaction relative to the product's actual importance. This law also explains a broader pattern in how we experience choice and freedom generally, sometimes called psychological reactance. When a choice or an option is taken away or restricted, we don't simply adjust our preferences calmly. We tend to want the restricted option more than we did before the restriction, purely because it has been restricted. This is part of wanting something outright without addressing the underlying appeal so often backfires, generating increased interest and even black market demand precisely because of the ban itself, a pattern documented across contexts as different as censored media and restricted substances. Recognizing this law gives you a genuinely useful filter to apply the next time you feel a surge of urgency around a purchase, a decision, or an opportunity. Ask directly whether the scarcity is real and relevant to the underlying value of what's being offered, or whether it's simply a manufactured signal designed to bypass your slower, more careful judgment. A genuinely rare, one-of-a-kind opportunity deserves real weight in your decision-making. A countdown timer reset by the same website every single day you visit it deserves considerably less. The test is simple, if not always easy to apply in the moment. Would I still want this if I imagined it were freely available right now with no deadline attached? If the honest answer is no, the scarcity itself, not the object, was the actual source of the desire, and recognizing that distinction is often enough to diffuse its pull entirely. Law 15, the law of default paths. When European countries were compared on their organ donation rates in the early 2000s, researchers Eric Johnson and Daniel Goldstein noticed something that seemed to defy explanation through culture, religion, or public attitudes toward donation. Countries like Germany and the Netherlands, with organ donation consent rates in the range of 10 to 20%, sat right next to countries like Austria and France, with consent rates above 99%, despite broadly similar cultural attitudes toward donation across these neighboring nations. The difference wasn't belief. It was paperwork. The low consent countries required citizens to actively opt in to becoming a donor. The high consent countries made donation the default, requiring citizens to actively opt out if they didn't want to participate. In both cases, the actual choice, donate or don't, was identical and equally available. Almost no one changed the preset default either way. This finding, since replicated across many other domains, points to one of the most powerful and least appreciated forces shaping human behavior, The default option in any system, the path that requires no action, no form, no decision at all, captures an enormous, often overwhelming share of outcomes, regardless of what people say their actual preferences are when asked directly in a survey. This isn't because people don't care about the outcome. Organ donation is a decision most people report caring about deeply. It's because acting against a default requires effort. And that effort, filling out a form, making a call, checking a box, is a real cost that a surprising number of people, even ones with strong underlying preferences, simply never get around to paying. This law has been documented with equal force in retirement savings. Research on 401(k) enrollment in the United States found that when companies switched from requiring employees to actively opt in to a retirement savings plan, to automatically enrolling every employee by default with an option to opt out, participation rates jumped from roughly 40% to well over 90% at some companies, among the exact same employee population, with the exact same plan terms, the exact same match from the employer. Nothing about the financial logic of saving for retirement changed. Only the default did, and the default did almost all the work. The reason this law is so powerful is that it operates on a combination of forces already discussed earlier in this book. The depleted, limited willpower described in Law 2 makes any additional decision feel more costly than it should. The fast, effort-averse thinking described in Law 1 treats the path requiring no action as the reasonable choice, unless a strong reason emerges to override it. And simple procrastination, universal across humans, ensures that even people who fully intend to eventually switch away from a default often simply never do, not because they changed their mind, but because life filled the gap where that decision was supposed to happen. This means the defaults built into the systems around you, your phone's privacy settings, your employer's benefits enrollment, the checkbox pre-selected on a subscription form, the auto-renewal terms of a service you signed up for once and forgot about, are not neutral background features of the world. They are, in a very real sense, choices being made on your behalf by whoever designed the system, and those choices often serve the designer's interests rather than yours. A default that's easy to leave in place, because leaving it in place requires zero effort, will often stay in place indefinitely, regardless of whether it actually reflects what you'd choose if you sat down and thought about it carefully. The most direct, practical response to this law is deceptively simple, though it requires deliberate effort, precisely because effort is the whole obstacle this law describes. Periodically audit the defaults that are quietly governing significant parts of your life. Check what you're actually enrolled in, what you're actually opted into, what boxes were pre-checked the last time you signed up for something, rather than assuming that because you never actively chose a setting, it must not be affecting you. And when you are the one designing a system, a form for others to fill out, an app, an organizational process, recognize the significant ethical weight that comes with choosing a default, because you are not simply offering people a neutral menu of options. You are, for a large share of the people who will interact with your system, effectively making the decision for them. The deepest lesson of this law is one that connects back to nearly every law before it. The path of least resistance is not a minor factor in human behavior for an enormous number of decisions, especially ones we don't feel strongly enough about to fight friction over. It is very close to the entire explanation. Part 4. Time. How memory, anticipation, and mortality distort the present. Law 16, the law of the shrinking future. Psychologist Laura Carstensen noticed something curious in her research on aging. Older adults, on average, report higher emotional well-being and greater satisfaction with their social relationship than younger adults, despite facing more physical decline, more loss of loved ones, and an objectively shrinking amount of remaining life. This seemed to contradict a natural assumption that awareness of limited time ahead would produce more anxiety and less contentment, not more. Carstenson's explanation developed over decades into what she called socio-emotional selectivity theory, turns on a simple but powerful idea. It isn't age itself that reshapes priorities, but the perceived amount of time remaining. As people sense their future horizon shrinking, whether through advancing age, a serious illness, or any other circumstance that makes remaining time feel finite rather than open-ended, they systematically shift their goals away from expanding knowledge and social networks and toward deepening the relationships and experiences that already matter most to them. Carstensen demonstrated this wasn't simply about age by studying younger people facing foreshortened futures for other reasons, including patients with terminal illness and, in some of her research, young adults living through periods when their future felt abruptly uncertain. In each case, a shrinking sense of remaining time produced the same shift. Less energy invested in expanding one's world, more energy invested in what already mattered most. This theory helps explain a pattern many people notice anecdotally. Older adults tend to maintain smaller social circles than younger adults, but report higher satisfaction with the relationships within those circles. This isn't decline. Carstensen's research suggests it's closer to a rational, adaptive reallocation of limited emotional resources, deliberately investing less in broad, exploratory social connection and more in the handful of relationships that provide the deepest meaning, precisely because the perceived time available makes that deeper investment feel more worthwhile than the broader one. The practical power of this law lies in an uncomfortable but useful realization. You don't have to wait for old age or a health crisis to access the clarity that a shrinking future horizon provides. The awareness itself, genuinely, viscerally grasping that your own time is finite right now, at whatever age you happen to be reading this, can produce the same reprioritization that Carstensen documented in people who arrived at that awareness through age or illness. This is part of why so many people who survive a serious health scare describe a lasting shift in how they spend their time afterward, often summarized as "I stopped sweating the small stuff," not because the health scare taught them a new fact about mortality in the abstract, but because it made that fact emotionally real and present in a way it hadn't been before. There's a related concept worth understanding here, drawn from research on what's sometimes called temporal landmarks, significant transition points like a birthday, a new year, or a graduation that prompt people to step back and evaluate their life as a whole rather than remaining absorbed in its daily details. Studies on goal-setting behavior have found that people are significantly more likely to pursue meaningful personal change immediately following these landmark moments, a phenomenon researchers have called the fresh start effect. Landmarks work, at least in part, because they briefly interrupt our usual sense of time as an undifferentiated, endless stream, forcing a momentary awareness of time passing and a future horizon that, however far off, is not infinite. You can deliberately borrow this mechanism without waiting for a birthday or a health crisis to hand it to you. A useful practice, drawn loosely from both Carstensen's research and broader work on mortality salience, is to periodically and deliberately imagine a meaningfully shortened timeline. Not morbidly, but practically. If you knew with confidence that you had 5 more years of full health and capacity, would you be spending your time the way you're spending it now? Would you be maintaining the relationships you're currently maintaining at the depth you're currently maintaining them? Or would something shift? This exercise tends to surface, quickly and often uncomfortably, a gap between how people actually spend their days, chasing expansion, accumulation, and breadth, and how they say they want to be spending their days once the horizon feels closer, which usually looks a great deal more like depth, presence, and connection. The shrinking future law suggests that this gap doesn't have to wait for time to actually run short before it closes. It can close the moment you allow yourself to feel, rather than merely know, that your time was always finite, and that the version of your priorities that shows up when the horizon feels close is very often the truer, more considered version, not a fearful contraction, but a clarifying one. Law 17, the law of anticipated regret. Researchers studying decision-making have long been fascinated by a curious asymmetry in how people evaluate their own past choices, first documented systematically by psychologists Thomas Gilovich and Victoria Medvec. When people are asked, later in life, what they regret most, the overwhelming pattern that emerges across studies is not regret over actions taken that went badly. It is regret over actions never taken at all, the degree never pursued, the relationship never attempted, the risk never taken, the trip never planned. Gilovich and Medvec found that in the short term, people report more regret over specific mistakes and failures, but over longer time horizons, regret over inaction consistently comes to dominate, growing larger and more persistent the further away the missed opportunity recedes. The explanation researchers have proposed involves how the mind processes failure versus omission over time. A specific action that went badly comes with a built-in resolution. It happened, it's finished, and the mind can often construct a story around it, a lesson learned, a reason it makes sense, a way it was meant to be. An action never taken, by contrast, has no natural endpoint. It remains permanently open-ended, an unresolved question the mind can return to indefinitely, generating an ever-expanding sense of what might have been, unconstrained by the messy, limiting details that any actual attempt would have introduced. Regret over inaction festers precisely because it never has to confront the reality of how the path actually would have gone. This research connects to a broader and highly influential body of work on what's called anticipated regret. The finding that people don't just experience regret after a decision goes badly. They actively factor the prediction of future regret into decisions they're making right now, often more heavily than they factor in the actual probability of a bad outcome. Studies on medical decision-making, financial choices, and everyday consumer behavior have all found that people will frequently choose an objectively worse option, specifically because it minimizes the anticipated feeling of regret, rather than maximizing expected value or likely outcome. A well-documented example comes from research on stock trading behavior. Investors show a strong, consistent tendency to hold on to losing stocks longer than is financially rational, and to sell winning stocks earlier than is financially rational, a pattern researchers call the disposition effect. Part of the explanation is anticipated regret. Selling a losing stock locks in a definite, undeniable loss, and the accompanying regret of having been wrong, whereas holding on to it preserves the comforting possibility that it might still recover, delaying the moment of confronting that regret indefinitely, even at real ongoing financial cost. Understanding this law gives you a genuinely useful decision-making tool, one used deliberately by people who study their own choices carefully. When facing a difficult decision, especially one involving a choice between taking a risk and playing it safe, it's worth explicitly asking not just, what outcome is most likely, but, which choice will I regret more in 10 years, having tried and possibly failed, or never having tried at all? Given what Gilovich and Medvec's research suggests about how regret over inaction compounds and grows over time while regret over honest attempts tends to resolve and fade, this question often points toward a clearer answer than a purely probability-based calculation would. This doesn't mean every risk is worth taking, or that anticipated regret should override every other consideration. Some inactions are genuinely wise, and some risks are genuinely reckless, and this law is not a blanket argument for impulsiveness. But it does mean that the felt weight of what if it goes badly deserves to be balanced consciously against the much less viscerally felt, but research-confirmed heavier, weight of what if I never find out. Most people's decision-making instinctively overweights the first kind of regret and underweights the second, because a potential future failure feels vivid and immediate in the moment of deciding, while a potential future feeling of missed opportunity remains abstract and distant until, years later, it isn't distant anymore, and by then the choice to have tried is no longer available at all. Law 18, the law of the peak end. In a study that has become foundational in the psychology of experience, Daniel Kahneman and his colleagues asked participants to undergo two versions of an uncomfortable medical procedure, a colonoscopy, in the specific study, and to rate their moment-to-moment discomfort throughout. In one version, the procedure ended right after the most uncomfortable moment. In the other version, the procedure included the same peak discomfort, but was deliberately extended afterward with a period of milder, still unpleasant sensation before finally ending. Logically, the second version involved strictly more total discomfort, the same peak, plus additional unpleasant time, and yet participants who experienced the longer version with the gentler ending rated the overall experience as less unpleasant and were more willing to undergo a repeat procedure than participants who experienced the shorter version that ended abruptly at the peak. This finding gave rise to what Kahneman termed the peak end rule. When people evaluate a past experience, they do not average the intensity of every moment. They rely heavily on just two data points, the single most intense moment of the experience, whether positive or negative, and how the experience felt at its very end, largely ignoring both the actual duration of the experience and the sum total of everything that happened within it. Kahneman called this the difference between the experiencing self, which lives through every moment as it happens, and the remembering self, which constructs a simplified, distorted summary afterward. And it is almost always the remembering self's distorted summary, not the experiencing self's moment-by-moment reality, that determines the decisions you make about the future, including whether to repeat an experience at all. This law reshapes how you should think about designing almost any extended experience, for yourself or for others. Vacations, celebrations, difficult conversations, even long projects at work are not remembered as an accurate average of how they felt throughout. They are remembered disproportionately by their most intense moment and by how they wrapped up. A wonderful 2-week vacation with a frustrating, chaotic final day at the airport will often be remembered less fondly overall than a shorter, more modest trip that ended on a genuinely pleasant note, even if the longer trip contained, by any objective accounting, vastly more total enjoyable time. This has direct, practical implications worth taking seriously. If you are planning any experience you want to be remembered well, a party, a trip, a course of treatment you're guiding someone through, even a difficult multi-year work project, the peak end rule suggests that disproportionate attention should go toward two specific moments, making sure there's at least one genuinely great high point somewhere in the experience, and making unusually deliberate effort to ensure the ending lands well, even if that means the middle stretches are allowed to be more ordinary. This isn't dishonest engineering of memory. It's working with how memory actually operates rather than against it. The same way you'd adjust a message for how people actually read rather than how you wish they read. This law also offers a genuinely comforting reframe for difficult periods in life. If you're going through a hard stretch, a demanding season at work, a challenging medical treatment, a period of grief. The peak end rule suggests that the ultimate memory you carry of this period will not be a faithful average of every difficult day within it. It will be disproportionately shaped by the worst moment and by how things resolve. This means that a genuinely difficult law that ends with resolution, support, or even just a moment of unexpected grace can leave behind a far gentler memory than the day-to-day reality of living through it might suggest while you're in the middle of it. There's an important caution worth naming here, too. The peak end rule describes how your remembering self will judge an experience, not how much actual suffering or joy your experiencing self lived through moment to moment. And both of those things matter. Reducing the total duration of unnecessary suffering is still worth doing for its own sake, independent of how it will later be remembered. The experiencing self's well-being is not less real simply because the remembering self will summarize it inaccurately afterward. Understanding this law well means holding both truths at once. Minimize actual suffering where you can, and pay deliberate attention to peaks and endings, because both the living of an experience and the memory you'll carry of it afterward matter, and they are not, contrary to how it feels, the same thing at all. Law 19, the law of present bias. Behavioral economist Richard Thaler, working alongside Shlomo Ben-Artzi, designed a retirement savings program in the late 1990s built around a specific, well-documented quirk of human psychology. People are consistently willing to commit to saving more money in the future, even while being unwilling to save that same amount right now. Their program, called Save More Tomorrow, asked employees not to increase their retirement contributions immediately, but to commit in advance to increasing their contribution rate at each future pay raise. Because the sacrifice was scheduled for a future moment rather than demanded immediately, enrollment was far higher than for programs asking for an immediate increase, and once enrolled, the automatic nature of the future increases meant savings rates rose substantially over time, with relatively few participants opting out along the way. This program exploited what economists call present bias or hyperbolic discounting, a well-documented tendency for people to value immediate rewards disproportionately more than larger rewards available only after a delay, even when a simple, rational calculation would favor waiting. This isn't the same as ordinary patience running thin over long periods. The effect is specifically strongest around the present moment. Offered a choice between a smaller reward today and a larger reward in a year, people frequently choose to wait for the larger reward. But offered the same relative choice between a smaller reward today and a larger reward tomorrow, present bias reliably pulls many people toward taking the smaller reward immediately, even though, mathematically, waiting one additional day for meaningfully more money should be an easy decision either way. The near-term future gets discounted far more steeply than the distant future does. This same quirk has been documented across numerous domains beyond finance. Health researchers have found that present bias helps explain why people who fully intend to exercise, eat well, or quit smoking, starting tomorrow, so often fail to follow through when tomorrow actually arrives and becomes today. The immediate discomfort of exercising, or the immediate pleasure of a cigarette, gets weighted far more heavily in the moment of decision than it was weighted when the same choice was still comfortably in the future, being planned for rather than lived through. The practical significance of present bias is that it explains a huge portion of the gap between what people say they want and what they actually do, without requiring any story about weak character or lack of genuine desire. The person who genuinely, sincerely intends to start saving, start exercising, or start writing that book next month is usually being completely honest about their intention when they say it, because next month, viewed from today, doesn't trigger the same steep discounting that today itself does. The trouble is that when next month arrives, it will have become today, and the same discounting that made the decision easy to plan for in the abstract will now be working against actually following through. The most effective countermeasures to present bias, supported by research across many domains, involve exactly the mechanism Thaler and Benartzi built into their savings program, making commitments now that bind a future version of yourself before present bias has the chance to take hold of that future moment. This is why scheduling a workout with a friend who will show up and hold you accountable works better than simply intending to exercise alone. The commitment was locked in during a moment when the cost felt distant, and the social obligation makes backing out, once the moment arrives, considerably more costly than it would otherwise be. It's also why automated, set-it-and-forget-it systems, automatic savings transfers, automatic bill payments, subscription-based habit tools tend to outperform systems requiring an active decision at the moment of action. For exactly the same reason default paths outperform active choices, as discussed in Law 15. Understanding this law well means treating your future self with a certain protective skepticism. Not distrust exactly, but recognition that the version of you who exists tomorrow will value tomorrow's immediate comforts more heavily than today's you currently expects them to. The wise response isn't to demand more willpower from that future self. It's to build structures today, commitments, defaults, automated systems, social accountability that don't require your future self's willpower to hold up at all. Law 20, the law of the shadow of mortality. In the late 1980s, psychologists Jeff Greenberg, Tom Pyszczynski, and Sheldon Solomon began a research program built around a deceptively simple idea, drawn partly from the work of cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker. Human beings are the only species aware of the certainty of their own death, and this awareness, largely operating beneath conscious attention, exerts a continuous, quiet influence on behavior, belief, and values. They called their framework terror management theory, and the experimental method they developed to test it, called mortality salience, has since been used in hundreds of studies across the world. The basic experimental design is simple. One group of participants is asked to briefly reflect on their own death, writing a few sentences about what they imagine happening as they die. A comparison group reflects on some unrelated neutral topic, such as an upcoming exam or a minor physical pain. Both groups are then measured on a range of subsequent attitudes and behaviors. The consistent finding across a large body of this research is that even brief, mild reminders of mortality measurably shift people's behavior, typically in the direction of more strongly defending their own cultural worldview, showing increased affiliation with their own group, and expressing harsher judgment toward people or ideas that challenge their core beliefs. This research suggests something genuinely important about a hidden force shaping much of human social and political behavior, an unconscious undercurrent of anxiety about mortality, largely invisible to the person experiencing it, that gets managed by clinging more tightly to belief systems, identities, and group affiliations that promise a sense of meaning, permanence, or continuity beyond the self. Later research in this tradition has connected mortality salience effects to increased nationalism, harsher treatment of moral transgressors, and stronger commitment to religious and cultural belief systems, particularly in populations or moments where mortality has been made unusually salient during public health crises, following widely publicized violent events, or simply through experimental prompting in a lab. What makes this law particularly worth understanding is that it operates largely outside conscious awareness. People in these studies don't report feeling more anxious about death after the mortality reminder, and most don't recognize any connection between the brief writing exercise and their subsequent, measurably shifted judgments and preferences. The influence is real and measurable and almost entirely hidden from the very people experiencing it, which means a meaningful portion of political polarization, in-group defensiveness, and harsh moral judgment happening around you and within you may be partly an unacknowledged reaction to mortality anxiety rather than a purely reasoned response to the actual issue at hand. There's a second, quite different, and genuinely more hopeful body of research connected to mortality awareness, sometimes discussed under the heading of post-traumatic growth and drawing partly on the earlier work of researchers Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun. This research has found that people who confront mortality directly and consciously through a serious illness, a close brush with death, or the loss of someone significant, quite often report significant positive psychological change afterward, deepened relationships, clarified priorities, a stronger sense of personal meaning, and a reduced tendency to sweat minor, ultimately unimportant concerns. This is a strikingly different outcome from the defensive, anxious response documented in typical terror management research, and the key difference researchers point to is the manner of engagement. Brief, unprocessed reminders of mortality tend to trigger defensive anxiety management, while sustained, conscious, deliberately reflective engagement with mortality tends to produce clarity and growth instead. This distinction offers a genuinely useful, practical takeaway. The goal is not to avoid thinking about death, which the evidence suggests happens anyway, quietly, shaping your behavior whether you engage with it directly or not. The goal is to engage with the awareness of your own mortality deliberately, thoughtfully, and periodically, not as a passing anxious flicker to be suppressed, but as a genuine reflective practice, the kind found in contemplative traditions across cultures and eras, from Stoic philosophy's deliberate meditation on death to modern hospice and palliative care research on end-of-life clarity. Approached this way, the awareness of your own limited time stops functioning as a hidden force quietly making you more defensive and more tribal, and starts functioning as exactly what the post-traumatic growth research suggests it can become instead. One of the clearest, most reliable sources of genuine perspective and priority available to a human mind. Part 5. Meaning. How purpose and values determine whether you thrive. Law 21, the law of purpose over pleasure. Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist in Vienna before the Second World War, and he spent years in Nazi concentration camps, including Auschwitz, during it. What he observed there, and later wrote about in his memoir and clinical work, became the foundation of an entire school of psychotherapy he called logotherapy, through meaning. Frankl noticed something that seemed to defy simple explanations of human resilience. Among prisoners facing the same brutal conditions, the same starvation, the same daily probability of death, survival and psychological endurance did not track most closely with physical strength or prior health. It tracked most closely with whether a person retained some sense of purpose to live for, a person waiting for them outside, unfinished work they felt called to complete, a meaning they had not yet fulfilled. Frankl's observation, informal and clinical as its origins were, has since been supported by a substantial body of later psychological research on the relationship between meaning and resilience. Researchers studying well-being have consistently found that pleasure and meaning are related but genuinely distinct dimensions of a good life, and that they behave differently under conditions of hardship. Pleasure tends to require the absence of pain or difficulty to sustain itself. Meaning, by contrast, has repeatedly been shown to coexist with, and even be deepened by, genuine suffering. Studies on parents of children with serious disabilities on caregivers of family members with dementia, and on people enduring long, difficult medical treatments have found that these populations often report high levels of meaning in their lives, sitting alongside real, substantial, ongoing distress, a combination that would be far harder to sustain if meaning worked the same way pleasure does. This distinction matters because a culture heavily oriented around pleasure, comfort, convenience, entertainment, immediate gratification, can leave people ill-equipped for the genuinely difficult stretches every life eventually includes. A person whose sense of a worthwhile life depends entirely on feeling good moment to moment has no framework for enduring a period, sometimes a long period, in which feeling good simply isn't available. Grief, illness, the demands of raising young children, caregiving for aging parents, building something difficult that hasn't yet paid off. A person whose sense of a worthwhile life is instead anchored in purpose, in mattering to someone, in contributing to something, in moving toward a value they hold dear, has a much sturdier foundation for enduring exactly those stretches, because the foundation was never built on feeling good in the first place. Frankl's most famous formulation, developed from his own experience and refined through decades of subsequent clinical work with patients, was that meaning is not primarily found in what you get from life, but in what life is asking of you and in how you choose to respond to that demand. This reframing from what do I want from my life to what does my life in this particular moment seem to be asking of me is a significant psychological shift, because it locates the source of meaning outside the shifting, unreliable territory of momentary feeling and grounds it instead in something closer to responsibility, contribution, and response. Even in his descriptions of the camps, Frankl observed that some prisoners retained a form of dignity and inner freedom by choosing how to respond to circumstances they had no power to change, a freedom he insisted could never be fully taken away, regardless of what was done to the body. This law connects back to nearly everything discussed earlier in this book. The moving target of Law 5 explained why chasing happiness directly tends to backfire. This law offers the constructive alternative, pursuing purpose and contribution instead, with genuine satisfaction arriving, when it arrives, as a byproduct rather than a destination pursued directly. The redemptive narrative structure discussed in Law 4 gains its power precisely from this same distinction. A redemptive story isn't one in which suffering felt good. It's one in which suffering was woven into a larger sense of purpose, which is exactly the mechanism Frankl described as sustaining people through the worst conditions humans have inflicted on each other. The practical application of this law doesn't require surviving a concentration camp to access. It requires a genuine, honest inventory of what actually gives your life a sense of mattering. Not what feels pleasant in the moment, but what you would still consider worthwhile even on a day that wasn't pleasant at all. For most people, honestly examined, this tends to cluster around a small number of themes: contributing to people they love, doing work that connects to something larger than personal comfort, and growing through challenges rather than avoiding them. Pleasure is not the enemy of a good life, and this law is not an argument for embracing suffering for its own sake. But pleasure alone, unanchored to any deeper purpose, is a remarkably fragile foundation, one that collapses at precisely the moments a human life most needs something sturdier to stand on. Law 22, the law of values in conflict. Psychologist Shalom Schwartz spent decades studying human values across dozens of cultures around the world, developing what has become one of the most widely used frameworks in the social sciences for understanding what people actually care about. Schwartz identified a consistent set of basic human values, things like achievement, security, benevolence, tradition, self-direction, and stimulation, that appear in some form across virtually every culture studied. But Schwartz's research revealed something equally important. These values are not simply a checklist of separate priorities. They form a structured system in which some values naturally reinforce each other, while others sit in direct, often unavoidable tension. The value of security, for instance, tends to conflict structurally with the value of stimulation and novelty seeking. A life organized heavily around safety and predictability leaves little room for adventurous, risk-embracing choices, and vice versa. The value of achievement often conflicts with the value of benevolence toward others, since time and energy devoted to personal advancement is time and energy not devoted to caring for the people around you. Schwartz's research suggests that most people don't hold a single dominant value that organizes their entire life. Most people hold several genuinely important, competing values simultaneously, and much of what feels like internal turmoil, indecision, or self-contradiction is not actually a psychological flaw. It's an accurate reflection of holding multiple real values that, in a given situation, cannot all be fully honored at once. This reframing matters enormously for how you understand your own inner conflict. It's common to interpret an inability to make a difficult decision. Take the safer job or the more exciting one. Prioritize a demanding career or more time with family. Stay in a stable situation or pursue a riskier ambition as a personal failure of clarity or willpower. Schwartz's research suggests a more accurate and considerably kinder interpretation. You are not confused because something is wrong with you. You are torn because you genuinely hold two or more values that this particular situation places in direct competition, and no amount of additional thinking will make that competition disappear because it isn't a factual puzzle to be solved. It's a structural feature of holding a rich, multi-dimensional set of things you actually care about. This connects to a related and clinically influential idea from psychologist Robert Kegan's work on adult development, particularly his concept of the immunity to change, the observation that people frequently fail to make changes they sincerely say they want to make, not from lack of effort or commitment, but because they harbor a hidden competing commitment that the desired change would threaten. A manager who says she wants to delegate more, but never actually does, might discover, through Kegan's structured self-examination process, that she holds a competing, unspoken commitment to being seen as indispensable, a commitment that delegation would directly undermine. The failure to change isn't laziness. It's an unacknowledged values conflict, operating exactly like the structural tensions Schwartz identified, but hidden from the person's own conscious awareness until it's deliberately surfaced. Understanding this law changes how you should approach your own moments of stuckness and internal conflict. Instead of asking, "Why can't I just decide?" or "What's wrong with my willpower?" a more accurate and more productive question is, which of my genuine legitimate values are actually in tension here, and what would it look like to honor both as fully as this situation allows, rather than pretending only one of them matters? This doesn't guarantee an easy resolution. Some values conflicts are genuinely difficult without a clean answer that satisfies both sides completely. But naming the actual structure of the conflict honestly, rather than treating it as a simple failure of decisiveness, tends to produce far better outcomes and considerably more self-compassion than treating internal conflict as evidence that something is broken in you. It's worth adding a related, practical insight from Kegan's clinical work. The hidden competing commitment, once surfaced, usually turns out to be protecting against a specific underlying fear. The manager who won't delegate may be protecting against a fear of becoming irrelevant, not simply clinging to control for its own sake. Values conflicts, examined honestly, very often reveal something worth attending to directly, rather than working around indirectly. The goal of this law is not to eliminate internal conflict. For anyone holding a genuinely rich set of values, some conflict is permanent and even healthy. The goal is to stop mistaking that conflict for dysfunction and start treating it as information about the full, complicated, legitimate range of things that actually matter to you. Law 23, the law of the question you ask. In the field of cognitive therapy, pioneered by psychiatrist Aaron Beck, one of the central working insights is that emotional distress is often driven less by events themselves than by the specific, habitual questions a person's mind asks about those events. Beck's foundational research on depression found that depressed patients characteristically interpreted ambiguous or even neutral events through a narrow, negatively biased set of internal questions. What does this say about how worthless I am, rather than what actually happened here, and what does it mean? Cognitive therapy, which Beck developed largely as a treatment for depression, and which has since become one of the most extensively researched and effective forms of psychotherapy available, works substantially by teaching patients to notice and deliberately revise the specific questions their minds default to asking. This insight extends well beyond clinical depression into ordinary daily decision-making and self-reflection, and it connects to research from the emerging field sometimes called question-based thinking, alongside older traditions in Socratic philosophy that recognize the same basic principle thousands of years ago. The specific way a question is framed doesn't just seek an answer. It actively constrains and shapes which answers become available to find. Ask, why do I always fail? And your mind, remarkably efficient at answering the literal question posed, will readily generate a list of past failures, reinforcing the premise embedded in the question itself. Ask instead, what specifically went wrong this time, and what would need to be different next time? And the same mind, asked a differently structured question, generates a completely different, far more useful category of answer. This is closely related to what researchers studying negotiation and problem-solving call reframing, deliberately restating a problem in different terms to open up solution paths the original framing obscured. A classic example from negotiation research involves two people fighting over an orange, each insisting they need the whole thing. The unproductive question is, how do we split this fairly? The more productive question, once someone thinks to ask it, is, what does each of us actually need the orange for? Which, in the original illustrative case behind this now famous example, revealed that one party needed only the peel for zest, while the other needed only the fruit for juice. A solution invisible to anyone stuck asking the first question and never arriving at the second. The practical power of this law is that it gives you a genuinely useful, always available lever for shifting your own internal experience, independent of changing the actual external circumstances you're facing. When you notice yourself stuck in a spiral of unproductive thought, rumination, self-criticism, circular worry, it's worth pausing to identify the specific question your mind is currently, often unconsciously, running on repeat. Why does this always happen to me is a different question, generating a different category of answer. Then, what is this situation actually asking of me right now? And what's the next useful step? What's wrong with me generates entirely different material than what would someone who cared about me, looking at this situation clearly, actually suggest I do next. This doesn't mean forcing artificial positivity onto genuinely difficult situations, or refusing to acknowledge real problems and real pain. That would simply replace one distorted question with another, equally dishonest one. It means recognizing that most situations can honestly support multiple different questions, and that the question you happen to default to, usually out of habit rather than deliberate choice, significantly shapes what you're capable of noticing, feeling, and doing next. Beck's cognitive therapy research suggests this isn't a minor rhetorical trick. For many people struggling with depression and anxiety, learning to notice and revise their habitual internal questions produces measurable, lasting improvement in how they experience their own lives without changing a single external circumstance. The deeper implication of this law is that you have more control over your own thinking than the automatic, seemingly involuntary flow of thoughts might suggest. Not control over the fact that thoughts arise, which is largely outside conscious command, but real, exercisable control over which specific questions you choose to sit with and pursue once a thought does arise. The question you ask yourself in any difficult moment is rarely neutral. It is already quietly shaping the answer you're about to find, long before you consciously arrive at it, which means learning to ask better questions is one of the most directly practical skills available to you from everything in this book. Law 24, the Law of Earned Growth. Psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun, whose work was briefly mentioned in Law 20, spent years studying survivors of severe adversity, combat veterans, cancer survivors, bereaved parents, survivors of natural disasters, and documented a finding that runs directly against a comforting cultural assumption. Comfort and ease, on their own, rarely produce significant psychological growth or transformation. What Tedeschi and Calhoun found, and named post-traumatic growth, is that struggle, properly processed and made sense of, is one of the most reliable catalysts for the kind of deep, positive change people describe as genuinely life-changing, including strengthened relationships, a renewed sense of personal strength, a clarified sense of priorities, and a deepened appreciation for life itself. It's essential to be precise about what this research does and doesn't claim, because it's easy to distort into something harmful. Tedeschi and Calhoun were emphatic that trauma itself is not good, that suffering should never be sought out or romanticized, and that not everyone who experiences severe adversity reports growth. Some people are simply harmed, with lasting damage and no compensating benefit, and it would be a serious disservice to imply otherwise to someone in the middle of genuine suffering. The finding is narrower and more precise than suffering makes you stronger. It is that struggle, when a person is eventually able to actively process it, find some meaning within it, and integrate it into their larger life story, connecting directly back to the narrative work discussed in Law 4, frequently produces growth that comfortable, unchallenged periods of life simply don't tend to generate on their own. This connects to a broader, well-established finding in the psychology of skill development and resilience, sometimes discussed under the concept of desirable difficulties, a term coined by researchers Robert Bjork and Elizabeth Bjork studying learning and memory. Their research found that learning conditions which feel harder and less immediately successful in the moment, being tested on material before you've fully mastered it, spacing practice out over time rather than cramming it together, deliberately interleaving different types of problems rather than practicing one type repeatedly, consistently produce stronger, more durable long-term learning than easier, more comfortable study methods that feel more productive while they're happening. The discomfort isn't a side effect to be minimized. In these specific, well-studied conditions, the discomfort is a necessary part of the mechanism that produces the deeper learning. This same pattern shows up in physical training, where the muscle damage induced by resistance exercise is the specific biological signal that triggers the growth and repair process, making muscles stronger afterward. A body that experienced no productive strain would have no reason to adapt and grow. It shows up in organizational research on high-performing teams, where studies have found that teams who face and openly work through significant early conflict often develop stronger long-term cohesion and performance than teams that avoided conflict altogether, because the unavoidable friction, when actually addressed rather than suppressed, builds a kind of tested trust that untested harmony never develops. The practical implication of this law is a meaningful reframe of how to relate to the difficult periods you cannot avoid, and even how to think about the difficult periods you might choose to pursue deliberately. This is not a case for seeking out unnecessary suffering, and it's important to say clearly that some hardship is simply harmful and should be avoided or minimized wherever genuinely possible. But it is a case for recognizing that a life carefully engineered to avoid all discomfort, all difficulty, all risk of failure is not actually the safest path to a strong, resilient, well-developed life. It is closer to the opposite, producing a kind of untested fragility that the research in this law suggests tends to break more easily under pressure that eventually, inevitably, arrives anyway. Understanding this law well means holding two things at once, carefully, without collapsing them into each other. Genuine compassion for yourself and others in the midst of real struggle, without rushing to extract a silver lining before someone is ready for one, alongside a longer-term recognition that struggle, once survived and eventually made sense of, is very often where the sturdiest, most valuable parts of a person get built. The goal is neither to chase difficulty for its own sake, nor to engineer a life of maximum comfort. It's to stop being surprised or ashamed when growth, once it arrives, turns out to have arrived through a door-marked struggle rather than the door-marked ease that our culture so often promises but rarely delivers through. Law 25. The law of the pilot, not the puppet. We've now covered 24 hidden laws, and if you've read this far, you may be feeling something like the discomfort I promised you back in the introduction. The growing, slightly vertiginous sense that far less of your behavior is freely chosen than you'd like to believe. Your fast, automatic thinking usually beats your slow, deliberate reasoning to the punch. Your willpower rises and falls like a mood rather than holding steady like a trait. Your memories rewrite themselves every time you revisit them. Your sense of your own life's meaning depends heavily on which narrative structure you happen to apply to the same set of facts. Anchors, frames, defaults, scarcity, and the mere presence of other people quietly steer choices you experience as entirely your own. It would be reasonable at this point to wonder whether you have any real agency at all, or whether you're simply a puppet, pulled along by strings you can't see. I want to offer you a different way to hold everything you've just learned, because the puppet framing, while an understandable reaction, is not actually where this book's evidence leads. Consider the difference between a puppet and a pilot. A puppet is moved entirely by external strings, with no awareness of the forces acting on it, and no capacity to resist or redirect them. A pilot, by contrast, operates inside a genuinely powerful set of forces they didn't create and can't switch off. Gravity, wind, weight, the physics of lift and drag, and yet a skilled pilot, precisely because they understand those forces intimately, is able to work with them deliberately to go exactly where they intend, achieving a level of control that would be completely impossible for someone unaware that those forces existed at all. This is the deeper purpose of everything in this book. None of the 25 laws you've read are forces you can simply switch off through willpower or good intentions. The anchoring effect works even on people explicitly warned about it. Present bias will always discount tomorrow's rewards more steeply than distant ones, and your memory will keep quietly reconstructing itself, no matter how much you'd prefer it functioned like a recording. But a person who understands these forces intimately, the way a skilled pilot understands aerodynamics, gains something genuinely powerful: the ability to work with these forces deliberately, building the waiting period rule around fast thinking, the environmental redesign around depleted willpower, the deliberate default audits around the path of least resistance, rather than being silently steered by forces they never learned to see. This is also, I'd suggest, a more honest and more useful form of self-respect than the illusion of pure unconditioned free will that our culture often implicitly promises. Believing you make every choice from a position of complete, unconstrained rational freedom sets you up to blame yourself harshly whenever one of these deeply human, deeply universal forces, depleted willpower, present bias, social conformity, an unconsciously absorbed frame, inevitably shapes your behavior anyway, as it does for every single person who has ever lived without exception. Understanding these laws replaces that harsh, unrealistic self-judgment with something more useful, an accurate map of the actual terrain, allowing you to build real, workable strategies instead of simply feeling guilty when willpower alone, unsupported by any structural understanding, predictably fails. Integration, in practice, looks less like memorizing all 25 laws as a checklist and more like developing a general disposition, a habit of pausing at meaningful decision points to ask a version of the same underlying question. What forces are actually operating on me right now, in this specific moment, and am I responding to them deliberately or simply being carried by them without noticing? Sometimes the honest answer will be that a particular law is working in your favor, and there's no need to intervene. Not every decision requires this level of scrutiny, and constant vigilance would be exhausting and unnecessary, particularly for the low-stakes choices your fast, efficient thinking handles perfectly well on its own. But for the decisions that genuinely matter, who you marry, what you build your working life around, how you treat the people closest to you, how you spend the finite, non-negotiable time you have, this habit of pausing to check which forces are actually steering you is, I think, close to the entire practical value of everything this book has tried to offer. You are not a puppet, moved by strings you'll never see or understand, but you were never a fully autonomous, unconditioned free agent either, and no human being ever has been. You are something more interesting than either of those extremes, a mind built from ancient, powerful, universal patterns, capable, uniquely among the systems those patterns operate within, of learning to recognize its own machinery and fly it on purpose. That is not a small thing. It may, in fact, be the entire difference between a life that happens to you and a life you actually build. Conclusion. From awareness to action. When we began this journey, I told you a story about a business deal that collapsed because of a single meaningless number. At first, it seemed like a story about money. Then it became a story about psychology. Now perhaps you can see what it was really about. It was a story about all of us, because every day, invisible forces shape our thoughts before we realize we're thinking, influence our choices before we believe we've chosen, and quietly redirect the course of our lives without asking for permission. That is the hidden architecture of human behavior. Throughout this book, you've explored 25 laws, not 25 tricks, shortcuts, or motivational slogans, but 25 recurring patterns that quietly govern the human mind. You discovered that your own mind is not a single voice, but a conversation between competing systems, that your memories are not recordings of the past, but stories constantly rewritten, that your identity is shaped less by what has happened to you than by the meaning you assign to those experiences. You saw how other people influence you in ways that often feel like your own independent decisions. How social proof, reciprocity, belonging, and status silently guide judgments you believed were entirely your own. You discovered that your environment is never neutral. A room, a price, a headline, a default option, a simple change in wording. Each has the power to alter your behavior without ever announcing its presence. You learn that time itself bends human judgment, that we overvalue the present, underestimate the future, remember experiences inaccurately, and often make today's decisions through the distorted lens of tomorrow's regrets. And finally, you reached perhaps the most important realization of all. A meaningful life is not built by chasing pleasure. It is built by pursuing purpose, because purpose gives direction to suffering, clarity to uncertainty, and strength to continue long after motivation disappears. But knowing these laws is not enough. Knowledge has never changed a life on its own. Awareness only becomes power when it changes the way you see. And once the way you see changes, the way you decide begins to change. You don't need to memorize every law in this book. You only need to begin noticing. Notice the first number that tries to anchor your judgment. Notice the headline trying to frame your opinion. Notice when the crowd feels safer than independent thought. Notice when scarcity makes something seem more valuable than it really is. Notice when your future self is quietly sacrificed for today's comfort. Notice the story you're telling yourself and ask whether it's true or simply familiar. These moments of awareness may seem small, but lives rarely change through dramatic moments. They change through thousands of small decisions made with slightly clearer vision than the day before. You'll still make mistakes. You'll still be influenced. You will still experience fear, bias, uncertainty, attachment, and regret. That isn't failure. It's part of being human. The difference is that from this point forward, you'll recognize those forces while they're happening. And recognition creates choice. Choice creates freedom. Freedom creates responsibility. And responsibility is where a deliberate life begins. Perhaps the greatest lesson hidden within these 25 laws is this. You cannot control every influence that reaches your mind, but you can become the kind of person who notices those influences before they become your destiny. That is the difference between drifting through life and navigating it, between reacting and choosing, between living unconsciously and living awake. If this book has accomplished anything, I hope it has not simply taught you new ideas. I hope it has changed the questions you ask. Because better questions create better decisions. Better decisions create better lives. And better lives are rarely the result of luck. They are the result of understanding. So, as you leave this audiobook and return to your everyday world, remember this. Every conversation you have, every purchase you make, every relationship you build, every fear you overcome, every opportunity you accept or reject, every story you tell yourself will be shaped by forces that are often invisible. Now, they are a little less invisible, and that awareness may become one of the greatest advantages you will ever possess. Thank you for taking this journey. The hidden laws have always been there. The only thing that has changed is that now you can finally see them.